Well, good morning. I appreciate you all being here for this important announcement. We're here to update you on Operation Monitor and to report on an arrest that happened yesterday as a result of the work of Operation Monitor. As you all know, at the end of last year, Chief Dyer was briefing me on several public safety matters before I took office, and he alerted me of his concern of the potential increase in the number of high-risk sex offenders that would potentially be coming to Fresno as they got off of parole, and some of the confusion that was happening at the state level with just who was responsible for continued monitoring of these folks after they were off their parole. So we initiated Operation Monitor, and you probably recall that Plan A with Operation Monitor was that the Fresno Police Department would put GPS bracelets on these folks so that we could continue monitoring them. You probably also recall that there are gaps in the law as to whether or not the local jurisdiction has the authority to do that, even though the state, from an administrative perspective, has been sending letters asking local jurisdictions to take over. It's not clear in the law yet that the local jurisdiction has the authority to do that. So we had to revert to Plan B to implement Operation Monitor. We brought on 2 retired police officers to work part-time to perform the registrations and data entry of the offenders, and also maintain and review case records. And what that meant was we had the opportunity to free up 2 detectives to go into the field and actively monitor the sex offenders and make sure they're either in compliance with registration requirements or they're arrested for being out of compliance. So we now have feet on the street in our monitoring efforts, and those frontline resources have resulted in a very important arrest that Chief Dyer will tell you more about in just a moment. I believe that our focused approach and the additional resources that we've dedicated to this initiative are going to increase the effectiveness of our sex offender monitoring, and in turn will help to make our community safer. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chief Dyer.
I want to begin by thanking the mayor for her vision and her commitment to public safety. It was really as a result of her effort and her direction to me to make sure that we were doing all that we could as a law enforcement agency to protect our citizens from sex offenders, and that was very clear to me. She came on as the mayor, and actually before that. You know, the way that we had historically, the way we've operated in the police department in terms of making sure sex offenders are in compliance and we know where they're at as often as we can, was that we have 2 detectives that have been assigned full-time to our, what we call our 290 unit. And that 290 unit is responsible for keeping track of the 1,700 sex offenders that reside in the city of Fresno. And what happens is when an individual gets out of prison, they have 5 days to come in and register their address, where they're going to be living. And they also must then come in annually and register where they're living. And if they are a transient, meaning that they do not have a address of record, then they are required to come in every 30 days and register. As you can imagine, that takes a great deal of our investigators' time, not only for the purpose of registering and doing the preliminary investigative work, but they also do a risk assessment. When they interview these individuals, they want to know what makes them tick, what motivates them to commit sex crimes. And the reason that they do that is that when a crime does occur, then they are able to perhaps focus their attention on certain sex offenders when a pattern or a trend develops. And that is important. And so what happened when this all came to light, and the mayor wanted to make sure that we were keeping a close eye on sex offenders, we felt that the best avenue to do that at that point in time was to continue with GPS on these offenders. Those individuals that were on parole are getting off parole. Unfortunately, there is some ambiguity in the law, and it's not clear in terms of who can be responsible or who is responsible for lifelong monitoring. So we have taken what we believe to be not necessarily the next best step, but perhaps the best step. And that is to rely on human effort, our investigators out in the field, to keep a close eye on these individuals day in and day out. And we have 2 full-time detectives doing that, the same detectives that were registering these sex offenders. And in order to replace what they were doing, we took advantage of the Justice Assistance Grant. We've hired 2 retired police officers that have investigative experience to come in and take over the registration responsibilities, and that those two positions are funded for 2 years through a justice assistance grant, so no general fund money to cover that. The detectives' responsibilities are really threefold, and here's their primary focus. For those individuals that get out of prison and they miss that 5-day guideline or that 5-day deadline when they're supposed to register, their focus is going to be on those individuals, and they're actually going back to and starting with those individuals that have not registered for the longest period of time. And second, their effort is going to be focused on those individuals that we believe to be a risk. And the way that we're aware of that, the way that our investigators become aware of that, is on the Megan's website. Citizens can contact the Department of Justice through this website and provide them with information or suspicions regarding individuals that are sex offenders. Whether or not they're in close proximity to children, whether or not there's some activity that makes them suspicious, that information is then immediately relayed to our detectives, and they go out and do a compliance check and to pay a visit to them. And then third, our detectives are going to be focused on those individuals that would normally have GPS on them, that were on parole, that have since been released and had their GPS taken off of them. So that is what their focus is going to be, and they're going to be in the field day in and day out, making verifications. They started last week. Effectively, they became operational. It took about a 30-day period for the 2 retirees that came on board to be trained so that we could free them up, our 2 detectives, to go out in the field. And since that time, they've been doing verifications, compliance checks, address verifications, parole searches, and they've actually made 6 arrests. And I wanted to highlight one of those arrests for you today. Last Thursday, Detective Sean Bishop and Detective Ying Bang actually became aware of an individual that was out of compliance within our community. His name is Lawrence D. Williams. This is a very dangerous individual. We had information that he was perhaps staying in the area of the rescue mission. He was transient. He had not been in compliance. In fact, when he was released from prison, he is supposed to report to the parole office immediately and have GPS placed on him. He failed to do so. And this person was on the run. Back in 1966, he was convicted for a double murder in the state of Texas. He was subsequently released. He moved to the city of Merced. And in 1980, he was convicted for entering a home, doing a home invasion, and committing a rape. That individual served time and was subsequently released, and he moved to Fresno in 1989. And he was convicted of 2 counts of burglary and again was sent to prison. Upon getting out of prison, this individual failed to register as a sex offender in our city, and in turn was on the streets. We knew that he had a propensity for violence. There's no doubt in our mind that he was going to reoffend sexually and commit additional crimes in our community. Detective Sean Bishop did the investigation with our crime analysis unit and tried to determine where this individual might be. That led Sean over to the area of the Parole house. He actually went undercover. He spotted suspect Williams, who was riding by on a bicycle. He gave chase. Ultimately, there was a struggle that ensued, and he was taken into custody. And he has been removed from the streets of Fresno. He will at least do probably 16 months in prison for a parole violation. This is really only the beginning. We know that with what the state is facing today, this problem is only going to get worse. In fact, it used to be, prior to the last several months, that the state would fund housing for sex offenders for long periods of time. That is no longer the case. That funding is no longer there, or at least it's not there to the extent it was before. And instead of sex offenders being placed in housing for long periods of time, they are now funded by the state for a maximum of 60 days. And what does that mean to us as a community across the state of California? It means that more and more of these individuals will not have a place to stay, and therefore they're going to be transient. They're going to be out on our streets, just like this suspect was. And when they're transient and no one is keeping an eye on them, they become a higher risk to our community. And I can't think of a greater time that we need to have a close eye on sex offenders. And I want to thank the mayor again for that vision